This is a conversation with Franz-Stefan Gady, a military analyst and a European security expert from the Institute for International Strategic Studies. In this conversation, we've had a lot to cover, from the developments on the battlefield in Ukraine and the reasons for the Ukrainian problems in Kursk to the impact of the US military aid cuts, and how much of the US aid could be potentially replaced by Europe, and what would that take? And although since Monday, March the 10th, when we recorded this episode, the ban on the US aid has been lifted, I think that even that part is still relevant as well. Both because it explains how dependent Ukraine and Europe is on the US equipment, and because the American aid can be always taken away just as fast as it was now given back. But mostly, we talked about European security, about why Europe needs to decide how much it's actually willing to risk for Ukraine. What's the real problem with the potential European peacekeeping mission in Ukraine, or why Europe is now at the beginning of a seismic shift, and why it's never going to be the same again. The corporate sponsor of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. And now, enjoy the conversation. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
There's so much happening, and I want to cover a lot of different things now that I have you here, from the feasibility of European peacekeepers in Ukraine to the European and German rearmament plans that have been announced. But first, I think we need to talk about the most pressing issue of the moment, which is obviously the fact that the US has cut off its military aid to Ukraine and what impact that is likely to have. And I really enjoyed your commentary on this, and I want to talk about different aspects of it. But first, how big of an impact this will have, and how will Ukraine be able to deal without it if the flow of aid is not going to come back anytime soon?
So, first off, I think we need to look at this from a couple of different angles, including different time perspectives, right? From an immediate perspective, a short-term perspective, the slowdown or cessation of U.S. Military support, particularly intelligence sharing arrangements, but ammunition as well, will certainly have an impact, but it's not going to be a catastrophic impact in the short term. And it's most likely not going to have a catastrophic impact immediately on the fighting along the front line, which I would classify as the close battle. The close battle is anything from the zero line, that is, where the two sides are literally opposing one another on the front line, to around 30 kilometers, right? The reason being is that over the last 2.5 years, the Ukrainians have actually done a very decent job in terms of indigenization of certain capabilities. And I just want to point out two factors here. First off, strike drones. Ukrainians have increased the number of strike drones available. This year, I think they have a goal of producing almost anything below, was it 5 million strike drones or something like that? And last year they reached, I believe, 1.5, 1.6 million strike drones. So they can compensate here for firepower that they would otherwise only be getting from the West, primarily artillery, right? The second, so to speak, success story has been mines. Ukrainians have ramped up mine production, and this is also causing casualties on the Russian side. And third, of course, the third big pillar is artillery. And here, the Ukrainian progress has not been, as successful, perhaps, as in the other two categories. That is the indigenization of these capabilities is not as far advanced as with strike drones and mines, but Europeans can actually step in here if the United States will massively reduce or even completely stop for the duration of 2025 the delivery of artillery ammunition, particularly 155 millimeter cluster munitions. So the point is that these three pillars that I mentioned, mines, artillery, and strike drones, they're primarily for the close fight, so 0 line to 30 kilometers, and they're really meant to support the infantry in defensive operations, right? It can't really compensate for a lack of infantry at some point, right? Because Ukraine still suffers from a tremendous manpower shortage, but we can talk about that later. Let's focus on the U.S. military aid, where U.S. military aid will have certainly much more negative impact in the short term, but also the medium term, right? So anything from the next couple of weeks to the duration of 2025 will be when in the area of longer range targeting, particularly the sharing of real life targeting info on targets that are actually mobile, that are moving, air defense radar systems, for example, mobile Russian air defense systems that are used to protect critical infrastructure in Russia, or other high-value targets, including command and control nodes of the Russians, also troop concentrations of various kinds. So targets that essentially you hit beyond the 30-kilometer range, all the way to a couple of 100 kilometers behind the front line, right? And I think that's going to be problematic, but again, not immediately, because I do think the Ukrainians do have indigenous capabilities here that they can use. The major point being is that the effectiveness of these long-range strikes will be gradually, but at the end, quite massively reduced by the lack of U.S. Real-life data. And that's going to be a huge challenge. Now, I think the image that I want to leave the listeners with is that the Ukrainian military is not going to go over a cliff because of the cessation of military aid from the United States. But I think it reinforces overall quite negative trends for the Ukrainian armed forces, despite news that you've heard about recent counterattacks. The Ukrainians are by and large holding the front line. The front line is by and large stable, with a couple of exceptions. The Russian advance has slowed down. It's unclear why the Russian rate of advance has actually slowed down. There could be multiple reasons for that. I always warn people, to not really engage in any mono-causal explanation for certain developments on the front line or in the war in general. But it has been noticeable, and I do think we're going to see an uptick in Russian offensive operations again. We are already seeing that, for example, in the Kursk salient. That salient is little by little being reduced. I don't think, by the way, that the reduction of the Kursk salient has anything to do with the cessation of U.S. military aid or, intelligence sharing in particular. I think this has been a process that has been ongoing for quite a while. A lot of people have underestimated the adaptability of North Korean soldiers who are leading the charge, for example, there. There was a lot of ridicule in social media about, the effectiveness of North Korean tactics and so forth. And I kept always pointing out the fact that this is quite normal at the beginning when you throw an inexperienced military into a fight against a fairly experienced force. Countless examples during the Second World War, during other conflicts, where militaries actually learn quite quickly, and the North Koreans have learned quite quickly and are actually able to sustain casualties and still remain combat effective. And so Kursk is obviously one part of the front line where there has been massive activity over the last couple of days, but also in southern Donetsk, we've seen an increase in Russian military activities there again. So the point is that this is merely reinforcing what we're already seeing from a material perspective. Now, what I haven't talked about yet is sort of the morale dimension. And here I have to say, based on the last visit to Ukraine, morale has been fairly high. The troops on the front line have been exhausted, fatigued, obviously. They have a longing for peace to a certain degree, but a just peace, quote unquote. So not what in German we would call a Diktat Frieden, which means essentially Russians imposing their conditions on the Ukrainians without any recourse. That's not going to happen. And I have heard it time and again by various Ukrainian commanders that they'd rather die on, fighting and go down with their troops than surrender to the Russians or really withdraw unless it's absolutely necessary. So I do think we should not underestimate the Ukrainian will to resist in this military conflict. And war, at the end of the day, is a contest of will primarily, right? Um, and material factors in general play a huge role in this, but still, the matter of it remains true and valid that it is a contest of will first and foremost, and the impact of reduced military aid or a stop to use military aid could, of course, negatively impact morale. I just haven't seen it yet, and it could also have, at least in the short term, the reverse effect of actually encouraging the Ukrainians to fight on with much more determination, right? Having said that, at some point, of course, material factors are going to be not entirely indicative in what direction this war's heading. But I think it sort of narrows your options at some point. If you run low on ammunition, if you run low on troops that are willing to fight, and if you run low on other key weapon systems, platforms, and so forth, even with tremendous willpower, you're not going to be able to resist a modern military. And so overall, I think the situation by and large is stable in Ukraine. It's not catastrophic. The military, as I said, is not going off a cliff. U.S. military aid cessation is going to have a huge impact in the medium to long term. In the short term, particularly when it comes to the close battle, I think it's just reinforcing some pre-existing negative trends. But I do think that the Ukrainians still have a chance, essentially, with the support of the Europeans, to fight on, to inflict massive casualties on the Russian military. And if they play it smart, and if they come up with innovative ways, as they always have done in the past, in essentially fighting the Russian military, there is a chance that the outcome is not going to be as negative, I would say, as it could be, considering that this also, in terms of military history, is quite unprecedented when it comes to the United States dropping essentially support to a partner in whom the United States supported in a brutal war of aggression by another great power. As I said, I think in the past, even when Saigon fell in 1975 on April 30th, the Americans actually supplied the Republic of South Vietnam's military, or the Republic of Vietnam's military, with real-life intelligence up until the moment, essentially, North Vietnamese tanks crushed the embassy gate. So my point is that it is what it is. I would say it's a new dimension, I think, of I wouldn't call it vindictiveness, but it is something that one should keep in mind, I think, in the future, if the United States are your partner, or ostensibly your partner, in such an endeavor.
If you're enjoying this podcast, chances are that you like to know what's going on in the world of geopolitics. And if that's the case, you might want to sign up to my newsletter. There's a lot of news on geopolitics, but most of it just doesn't actually matter. It's just chasing headlines, emotions, and breaking news. What I want to do is to try to separate all this noise and find the signal, the stuff that actually does matter and will have consequences months and years down the line. And so in every edition, I pick out 3 things that do matter and explain why and what will be their future impact. You can find the link in the description, so check it out and sign up to stay informed. You've hinted at, or you've mentioned a lot of things that I want to dig deeper into and talk about in more detail. Maybe to summarize the impact that it's having, the way I understand it, and you can tell me if it's correct or not, is that the fact that they've cut off the aid now has an impact, but the impact is probably quite significantly smaller than it would have if they did it a year or 2 years ago, and maybe compared with when the US aid was stalled because of in Congress in spring of 2024.
Right. So yes, if I can jump in here, I didn't finish my point previously in my previous comment. So what I really specifically meant was that there's been primarily progress in terms of reordering the importance of artillery as a means to compensate for the lack of infantry on the Ukrainian side, and also to essentially create enough firepower within the close fight, the close battle from 0 to 30 kilometers, right? So 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, or last time also when U.S. Congress froze essentially military aid, the Ukrainians had to massively ration artillery shells, right? They went down to quite a low level. And the Ukrainians are already rationing artillery shells at the moment, right? But it's not at a level as they had to during the last time. And the Ukrainians actually can still keep up a decent fire barrage for a couple of more weeks, months, depending on how you look at it. And this is primarily because they have strike drones, they have mines, they have other capabilities that they can use instead of artillery to create firepower, or to essentially have sufficient firepower for the close fight. And this is essentially the main reason. The other point is also that they've made admirable progress when it comes to longer range strikes with drones. Also, various indigenous capabilities when it comes to command and control. Also, ISR capabilities, they've made some progress. So overall, we've seen a reduction on the dependence on the United States and Europe to a certain degree. However, I always have to caution, you cannot compensate for certain American capabilities in this war, right? When it comes to, for example, long-range air defense systems, when it comes to certain capabilities in the ISR field, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, right? You can always approach it to a certain degree, right? You can also have a certain capability that almost can compensate for it, but there are capacity issues. There are, issues of availability, of course. Then there are other issues that you see with certain fairly tested systems, such as the Patriot long-range air defense system, where essentially it's not just about soldiers having experience in battle or in combat, right? You also need that for your air defense systems or any other modern advanced piece of military hardware, because you need to reprogram your software with accurate threat data. Without going into details, there's a lot of stuff that you need to do and that you really primarily only can do, or you have a much larger advantage vis-a-vis other systems if they're used quite often in combat, and if you're able to collect a lot of data based on the use of these systems in combat, right? So certain systems like the Patriot, they're just indispensable essentially for keeping up Ukrainian air defenses. And I know there are certain, Italian, French systems that you can use that are actually in use in Ukraine, not in large quantities. They don't have enough interceptors for them. By the way, this, interceptors for Patriots, for Patriot systems, that's also obviously a challenge. But the major point is that there are just certain capabilities that the United States can only provide, and that Europe could only probably provide in the medium to long term. So there will be a gap, and this could be actually quite a significant development if it leads to, for example, the collapse of Ukrainian air and missile defense. And I think in this regard, Russia does have a certain degree of escalation dominance. And yes, these are just the realities. I also, by the way, find it quite strange to a certain degree that there's certain people who think they're doing Ukraine a favor by essentially saying that the situation in the battlefield is much more positive than it really is. I don't think that is doing any service to anybody, particularly not the soldiers on the front line. And we always get the sentiment back from soldiers on the front line that they're actually quite pissed off at these people who claim or misusing data and are trying to paint a more rosier picture than really is unfolding on the front line. So I think particularly during these critical times right now, I think it's very important to really present an accurate picture of the front line, help Ukraine address various shortcomings, try to figure out what Russia's true capabilities and capacity is for continuing this war, and plan accordingly. And disinformation or information warfare campaigns, yes, they are important, but they shouldn't really dilute good military analysis in this regard. And we see this quite often, to be honest, in the public domain.
Just a quick break here to let you know that the corporate sponsor of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. Thank you, Conductor, for sponsoring this podcast. And now, back to the conversation. I couldn't agree more. I think the North Koreans and their capability and their role is a good example of that. I think maybe on the note of Europe possibly replacing or partially replacing the US aid, to what extent, so that I better understand it and the listeners better understand it, to what extent is it about Europe being able to replace it by, stepping up, doubling down, and just building more of the stuff that it can build, and to what extent it's about that we just don't have the technology? I guess what I'm trying to ask is how much of an agency or how much of a role Europe actually can play in filling this gap if it really wants to, and if it really puts its resources there, and to what extent there are things that we just cannot do right now or in the near and midterm future, no matter how much we would like to.
Yes, I mean, that's a very good question. So first off, I would say what's probably the most critical contribution by the Americans besides intelligence sharing at the fact that they actually has succeeded in, helping Ukraine sustain this war effort by providing 1.5 millimeter cluster munitions at an extremely critical time of the war, by the way, right? Without that, without American intervention or Western intervention in general terms, I think this war could have been lost already in 2022. I'm not a believer in this theory or hypotheses that Ukraine could actually had like a successful, could have seen a successful end to this war in 2022 at some point in the fall. I think that's, frankly speaking, nonsense, for particularly if you know what was happening around that time in detail. But I'll tell you specifically what we can't in the short term and the medium term probably replace, besides U.S. certain ISR capabilities that the Americans are providing. Long-range air defense systems, Patriot interceptors, that's going to be a challenge. There are good European systems that are not as battle-tested, however, and where there is not a huge capacity to really expand production currently for multiple reasons. Eventually, I think in 26, 27, we could potentially see more of these systems in place and higher rates of production. But until then, it's going to be super, super difficult to replace long-range air defense systems provided by the United States and the respective interceptors. Secondly, I think surface-to-surface strikes or surface-to-surface strike capabilities. So that's rocket artillery and ballistic missiles. Here, the Europeans have practically no answer to U.S. systems. I should say, though, that contrary to popular beliefs and based on conversations that I've had with Americans who are in the know when it comes to these sorts of arsenals in the United States, there's actually very little that the United States could have sent in any case this year due to readiness issues. Also, we should never underestimate that the United States still, the U.S. Armed Forces at least, still see the People's Republic of China and the People's Liberation Army as its primary competitors. They are essentially preparing for a potential war in East Asia. At least that's their main focus. So they do need enough, essentially, reserves, quantities of ammunitions available to potentially fight such a war. And even there, I think the arsenals are actually quite depleted. And what you need for war in the Pacific is obviously long-range strike capabilities, surface-to-surface strike capabilities, including ballistic missiles such as ATACMS. So I think in general terms, even without the stop in U.S. military aid, it would have been actually quite a bad year had Ukraine build its operational concepts around essentially effectively fighting a deep battle with American long range, or at least like surface to surface strike capabilities. So I should say that. So these are the two categories that most obviously come to mind. But then also there's the political dimension that I should say. Europeans are just simply not used to being in charge when it comes to military affairs when there's an American in the room. So coordination capacity is quite low on the European side, despite NATO assuming certain responsibilities when it comes to coordinating Ukrainian military aid and other support, right? I think it's more of a political question, or a question of strategic culture, right? How you see the use of military force within your political system, and how you really want to think about military power from a more cultural perspective, right? And I think Europeans are extremely reluctant here still to do anything without American consent. And I keep on pointing out this one story where I was briefing a couple of NATO ambassadors a couple of months ago in a Baltics country. And I did a briefing on certain aspects of the war in Ukraine. And there was a very senior German diplomat getting up and he said, well, listen, that's all great what you were talking about, and, potential European involvement in all of this. But I just want to be clear. I don't think there's anything we really can do without the Americans in any of this. And I think that's a sentiment that's fairly widely shared, not just in Germany, but also in other parts of the world, also in the United Kingdom and many of the other quote unquote more martial countries in Europe. So that's an issue. And I think primarily it starts with a lack of will to actually think through national security problems, through a military lens, so to speak. Because I think very often, like a comprehensive security approach, as it's often called in Europe or the European Union in particular, is really just used as an excuse not to really think about military power or hard military power, or actually military strategy, which always requires making hard choices and certain trade-offs and risks, of course, right? Are we willing to actually endure any risks when it comes to this war in Ukraine? And I think the principal questions that all European countries have to ask themselves, that I think in part it has been answered, besides all the bombastic rhetoric, is, would we actually go to war with Russia over Ukraine? That's the basic question that we need to answer. Are our national European interests served by going to war with Russia over Ukraine? Because I don't think there's any middle ground here. There's no middle ground, right? You need to answer this question, yes or no. And if your answer is no, then you need to plan your strategy accordingly. You can't have rhetoric that essentially suggests, that you would be willing to risk quite a bit to keep an independent Ukraine or sovereign Ukraine at, the Europeans' eastern flank or along NATO's eastern flank. I'm not saying that Ukraine is going to collapse. I think it's highly unlikely that the Russians can actually achieve their principal war aims, installing a pro-Russian regime in Kiev, although I think they've revised that part, but at least trying to gain a neutral Ukraine on their western border, a reduced military, a Ukrainian reduced military, and a couple of other things. I think that Russian political aims and the military realities are also drifting apart, or have drifted apart quite a bit during this conflict, right? As I said, I don't think this, Ukraine is on the verge of collapse. This is not a military that is about to give in. This is not a state that is about to give in. And it's very obvious when you're there and when you see what the Ukrainians are doing and what they're capable of, right? But I do think for the Europeans, this is a good exercise in terms of getting, at least, it could help potentially. It's a forcing mechanism to actually get clarity on what they really want and what European interests and national interests of individual countries really are, and what they're willing to risk for it. But before that, they could just hide under the U.S. security umbrella, and that's no longer the case, essentially. And I think this ultimately is the key question. And to a certain degree, it has been answered, right? By and large, Europeans would not be willing to go to war with Russia over Ukraine, despite the rhetoric of certain Baltic countries and other Eastern European countries, which I don't really take very seriously.
I think that was excellently put. I agree. I want to talk more about the risks question a bit later on, but I really liked how the way you've put it, that the Europeans historically would never do anything or decide anything on their own if there's an American in the room. So do you see that starting to change now when the American in the room is not there anymore? Or do you expect that this will change and that we as Europeans are gonna start acting a little bit more mature in this field?
I believe that we are at the beginning of quite a seismic change.
Thank you for listening to this conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest of it, you can find it on my Patreon. Click the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics. And if you decide to become a supporter, you get bonus content, Patreon-only episodes, and you will be able to ask questions to my future guests.